The first survivor was found sitting in the middle of an old logging road that hadn't been used since the Eisenhower years, barefoot, wrapped in a flour sack stitched shut with rusted wire. He didn't speak when they approached him. He didn't even look up. He only kept tracing a circle in the dirt with one finger, over and over, as if afraid that stopping would allow something else to begin. They had been searching for bones. Hollow Colony was supposed to be a clerical error, a rumor left behind by coal dust and bad maps. Census data placed it in the mountains for 3 consecutive decades and then erased it entirely, as though the land itself had swallowed the ink. No deeds. No graves. No church records. Locals spoke the name only when pressed, and even then they spoke it sideways, like it might hear them. When the survivor finally spoke, his voice was worn thin, like fabric rubbed down to threads. He asked what year it was. When told, he shut his eyes and began to cry, but there was no relief in it. Only confirmation. More were found over the following days. 3 women in a cave system blackened by old fires. A teenage boy hiding beneath a collapsed barn that did not appear on any satellite image. All of them malnourished, all of them marked in the same places: wrists, ankles, along the jaw, as if they had once been held together by something patient and deliberate. They shared the same fear of nightfall. As dusk approached, they grew frantic, begging to be restrained, sedated, locked away from windows. One woman clawed her own face bloody when the sun slipped behind the ridge, screaming that the hollow would notice the dark had returned. Their testimonies were recorded separately, yet the details aligned with a precision that made the interviewers uneasy. They spoke of the ground breathing, of houses that grew lighter each year, as though losing weight, of a sound beneath their floors that learned their names. According to them, Hollow Colony had not been destroyed. It had been opened. They said the hollow was never a place you could leave, it was only a place that sometimes let you go. For decades, Hollow Colony existed only as a smudge between official certainty and whispered memory, a name that appeared just often enough in public records to suggest it had once been real, then vanished so completely that historians eventually treated it as a transcription error. Early census documents listed it among the Appalachian settlements that fed coal towns and logging camps, a place with families, children, livestock, and a modest population that held steady for nearly 30 years. Then, without explanation, the name stopped appearing. No record of relocation. No disaster report. No mention of decline. It was as if an entire community had stepped out of the ledger at the same moment. Archivists first noticed the anomaly while digitizing rural county records. Property deeds referenced land transfers from residents who did not exist anywhere else in the system. Birth certificates named a midwife tied exclusively to Hollow Colony, yet no death certificates bore her name. Church registries listed baptisms but no burials. The more researchers tried to anchor the settlement in verifiable history, the more the paper trail frayed. Maps contradicted one another. Survey lines overlapped empty forest. A post office code was assigned and then reassigned without explanation, leaving behind a paper ghost that led nowhere. Local historians attempted to resolve the mystery by interviewing older residents of nearby towns. The reactions were consistent and unsettling. Some claimed never to have heard the name at all. Others remembered it vaguely, like a childhood nightmare whose details had been deliberately forgotten. A few refused to speak, insisting that Hollow Colony was never meant to be written down and that bringing it back into conversation was a kind of invitation. Over time, these responses were dismissed as folklore, the kind of superstition that flourishes in isolated regions where history is passed mouth to mouth and truth wears many disguises. Eventually, an academic consensus formed. Hollow Colony was classified as a clerical myth, likely born from duplicated entries, misspellings, or the merging of multiple transient camps into a single false location. The settlement was removed from updated databases. Footnotes replaced pages. What could not be proven was quietly buried beneath explanations that favored human error over human absence. In doing so, the question of what happened was never answered, only dulled until it stopped being asked. But the land where Hollow Colony was supposed to have stood remained conspicuously untouched. No development followed. Trails skirted the area without reason. Satellite imagery showed tree growth that did not match surrounding regions, as though the forest itself had been disturbed and left to heal unevenly. Still, no official interest returned, because myths do not require investigation once they have been properly labeled, and the disappearance of Hollow Colony was ultimately treated not as a loss, but as a correction to history itself, a line erased to make the rest of the record feel whole again, even though something vast and unaccounted for had been removed from the middle of it. The discovery of the survivors did not come from a targeted rescue or a renewed belief in Hollow Colony, but from a routine environmental survey meant to assess soil stability in a remote stretch of the Appalachian Range. The team was small and unarmed, composed of geologists and forestry contractors accustomed to long days of isolation. Their instruments began to register anomalies almost immediately: ground temperatures that shifted without explanation, pockets of earth that collapsed inward despite solid rock beneath. It was assumed at first that old mine shafts were responsible, the kind that riddled the mountains like forgotten wounds. The first sign of human presence was a fire pit still warm beneath a layer of damp leaves. Nearby, boot prints led nowhere, vanishing abruptly as if the ground itself had closed behind them. The team followed the tracks deeper into the trees, where the forest grew unnaturally dense, branches knitting together overhead and dimming the daylight. Radios crackled and failed. GPS units froze. One of the surveyors reported hearing breathing that did not belong to any of them, slow and rhythmic, rising from below the forest floor. They found the first survivor at the edge of a ravine that did not appear on any map. He stood perfectly still, half hidden by ferns, his skin gray with ashen age. His clothes were handmade, stitched from feed sacks and animal hide, the fabric rubbed thin as paper. He did not react to their voices or their approach. Only when one of the team members touched his shoulder did he flinch violently, dropping to his knees and pressing his forehead into the soil as if asking forgiveness from the ground itself. More survivors emerged as the day wore on, drawn not by the rescuers but by some instinct that had already decided it was time. They appeared from caves, from beneath fallen trees, from gaps in the rock face that should not have been wide enough to conceal a body. There were fewer than expected, considering the population records, yet more than anyone was prepared to explain. Some were elderly, their bodies twisted by years of malnutrition. Others were children whose ages were impossible to guess, their faces both young and ancient in ways that defied categorization. None of them spoke freely. They avoided direct sunlight, shielding their eyes and retreating into shade whenever clouds thinned. They recoiled from metal tools and modern fabrics, touching them with cautious disbelief. When offered water from plastic bottles, several refused, insisting it was wrong and would wake something that had learned to sleep. Their language was English, but altered, worn smooth by repetition and isolation, certain words used as if they carried weight beyond meaning. As night approached, panic spread among the survivors. They clung to one another, begging the team to leave before dark, before the mountains noticed that strangers had arrived. One woman, no older than 30 by appearance, whispered that they were not survivors at all, only the ones the Hollow had finished with, the ones it no longer needed to keep close, and that finding them had not been an act of rescue, but a sign that something buried and patient had decided to loosen its grip just enough to let the world see what it had been holding all this time. Once the survivors were transported out of the mountains, their behavior began to trouble the medical teams more than their physical condition. It was not merely trauma or deprivation that defined their reactions, but a deep, instinctive terror of ordinary objects, as though the modern world itself carried hidden threats. Hospital lights triggered immediate distress, prompting screams and frantic attempts to crawl beneath beds or press their faces into walls. Several had to be sedated simply to endure basic examinations, their bodies shaking as if exposed to something hostile rather than help. Sunlight proved especially unbearable. When curtains were drawn back, the survivors reacted as though burned, shielding their eyes and pleading for darkness. One man collapsed into sobs, insisting the light would show them where he was, though he could not explain who them referred to. Mirrors were worse. At the sight of their own reflections, some turned away in horror, others stared too long, their breathing slowing until monitors registered alarming drops in heart rate. A young woman shattered a bathroom mirror with her fists, screaming that it was learning her face. Clocks produced a quieter, more unsettling response. The ticking of a wall clock caused visible nausea in several survivors, and digital displays led to confusion bordering on panic. Time, they explained haltingly, was not supposed to move that way. It was meant to stretch, to fold, to stop altogether when it had served its purpose. One survivor asked how the hours were being kept inside the building and whether they were allowed to escape at night. Another warned that counting minutes aloud would attract attention. Their fear extended to mundane rituals. They refused to sleep in separate rooms, insisting they had to remain close enough to hear one another breathe. They covered vents and drains, whispering that the hollow listened through open spaces. When nurses removed dirt from beneath their fingernails, several wept, apologizing repeatedly for breaking the seal. Even food became a source of dread. They preferred bland, root-based meals and rejected anything fermented or sweet, claiming it fed memory and memory fed hunger. Attempts to diagnose these reactions through known psychological frameworks failed. PTSD could not account for the consistency of their fears, nor the way their bodies responded before their minds could articulate distress. Brain scans revealed patterns of activity more consistent with long-term sensory adaptation than trauma alone, as if their nervous systems had been rewired to survive in an environment governed by rules no longer present. Doctors noted that when the lights dimmed and the building grew quiet, the survivors' vital signs stabilized, their bodies relaxing only when the world resembled the conditions they had fled. What unsettled the staff most was the certainty behind the survivors' behavior. There was no confusion in their terror, no hesitation. They acted with the confidence of people who had learned, through repetition and consequence, what could and could not be done. When asked why mirrors were dangerous or why sunlight was forbidden, they gave the same answer in different words, spoken with calm resignation rather than hysteria. They said the hollow learned people by watching them, and the things that reflected, measured, or revealed made that learning easier, and once the hollow learned you completely, it never let you leave yourself behind. As formal interviews began, investigators expected a single catastrophic event to explain the disappearance of Hollow Colony, something sudden and decisive that could be catalogued and understood. What emerged instead was a slow erosion, a drawn-out unraveling that took years to complete. The survivors spoke of no fire, no flood, no massacre. They described a long season of wrongness, subtle at first, almost polite in how it introduced itself, changing small things that were easy to ignore until ignoring them became habit. They said the land changed before the people did. Crops grew but tasted thin, as if the soil had forgotten what nourishment was supposed to be. Wells never dried, yet the water left a film on the tongue that lingered longer each year. Houses began to creak at odd hours, not with the familiar sounds of settling wood, but with slow, deliberate groans that seemed to answer one another across the settlement. At night, lights in distant homes flickered in patterns that repeated, though no one could agree on what they meant. Families withdrew inward. Doors stayed closed longer. Conversations shortened. Children stopped wandering beyond sight of their homes, not because they were forbidden, but because they no longer wanted to. The survivors said the colony did not fracture all at once, but hollowed itself from the inside, each household becoming a sealed room filled with quiet fear. Church attendance dwindled, then ceased altogether, not due to disbelief, but because the sermons no longer felt addressed to anyone present. Stranger still was the way time behaved. Days seemed to pass normally when measured by routine, yet memory failed to keep pace. Weeks collapsed into moments when recalled later. Seasons arrived without warning, as if skipping ahead. People began to lose track of deaths. Funerals were postponed, then forgotten. One survivor admitted they could not remember when their spouse had died, only that the house had felt lighter afterward, as if something had been removed without permission. Attempts to leave Hollow Colony were rare and unsuccessful. Those who packed their belongings found themselves delayed by minor obstacles that compounded until night fell. A broken wagon wheel. A sick child. A sudden storm that appeared without clouds. When they returned home, the decision to leave felt foolish, even embarrassing, like waking from a dream that had briefly suggested escape was possible. Over time, the idea of departure lost its urgency, then its meaning altogether. What frightened the survivors most was not the fear itself, but how ordinary it became. They learned to live alongside it, to adjust their lives around unspoken rules. Certain paths were avoided. Certain questions were never finished. The colony did not collapse, it thinned. People became quieter, more careful, less themselves, until what remained was not a community in decline, but a shell that still resembled one, standing intact while something essential had been slowly, deliberately removed from the inside, leaving behind structures that functioned just well enough to hide the absence of what had once made them alive. The survivors struggled most when asked to explain how the hollow first made itself known, because what they described did not resemble discovery so much as recognition. They said it began beneath the soil, not as a sound or a shape, but as a presence that responded. When crops failed and livestock sickened, people prayed as they always had, asking the land for mercy, for balance, for the return of what had been lost. At first, the answers felt like relief. A barren field produced a single, perfect harvest. A dying child recovered overnight. A collapsed mine sealed itself without crushing those inside. The colony learned quickly that asking worked. They spoke of the hollow as something older than the mountains but not separate from them, something pressed into the earth like a thumbprint that never faded. It did not speak in words. It answered through outcomes. When someone prayed with sincerity, something improbable but precise occurred, always addressing the request in a way that felt personal. A widow asked not to be alone, and a distant cousin arrived unannounced the next morning. A farmer begged for rain, and a storm formed only above his land, sparing the rest of the valley. These favors created gratitude before they created fear. Doubt entered slowly. A man questioned why his recovered cattle would not cross a certain part of the pasture. A woman wondered why the healed child refused to sleep unless buried beneath quilts, gasping as if the air were thinner at night. The hollow responded to doubt differently. Tools went missing. Wells soured. The same precise attention that had once granted miracles now corrected hesitation. The survivors said punishment was not violent, but instructional, designed to reinforce understanding rather than inflict pain. Over time, prayer shifted from faith to necessity. People learned what could be asked and what could not. They learned that the hollow disliked waste, disliked excess, disliked anything abandoned without purpose. Homes left empty too long decayed rapidly. Names spoken carelessly were followed by accidents. The colony adapted by narrowing itself, trimming away curiosity, ambition, and eventually memory. Children were taught to pray correctly before they were taught to read. Mistakes were not forgiven, only absorbed. What none of them admitted openly at first was that the hollow demanded participation. It did not feed on belief, but on attention. It required to be included in decisions, acknowledged in silence, consulted through ritual that grew more complex with each generation. Those who resisted were not struck down, but slowly unmade. Their presence faded. Their voices grew faint. Their absence became normal. The survivors insisted the hollow never lied. Every answer it gave was exact. The danger came from assuming precision meant kindness. They learned too late that what lived beneath them was not granting wishes, but reshaping the colony into something that fit its own need to be recognized, remembered, and obeyed, and once it learned how to answer prayer, it also learned how to punish disbelief by removing the parts of people that allowed them to imagine a life beyond the ground that listened so closely beneath their feet. The children of Hollow Colony were the first to show that something fundamental had shifted, though it took years for the adults to admit it. At birth, the infants appeared normal, small and quiet but healthy enough, their cries thin and brief as if conserving breath. As they grew, however, time did not move through them evenly. Some children remained small for far too long, their bones refusing to lengthen, their faces holding the same expression year after year. Others matured too quickly, their bodies advancing while their voices and movements lagged behind, creating an unsettling mismatch that no one knew how to name. Parents spoke of growth spurts that happened overnight, of children who went to bed unable to reach the table and woke up with bruised knees from bumping into furniture that no longer fit them. Teeth fell out and did not return. Or they returned twice. One boy cut his hand badly on a fence and healed before the blood had time to dry, the skin sealing itself with a faint warmth that frightened his mother enough to hide him indoors for weeks. Another child never healed at all, small wounds remaining fresh but painless, as though his body had forgotten the instruction to finish repairing itself. Most disturbing were the children who did not seem to age at all. They retained the same height, the same weight, the same careful expressions for decades. Their eyes grew older, sharper, burdened with observation, but their bodies stayed fixed in a narrow window of youth. The survivors said these children were quiet and obedient, unnervingly so, as if they understood rules that were never spoken aloud. They never asked about the world beyond the colony. They never expressed boredom. They watched the ground often, tilting their heads as if listening to a distant lesson only they could hear. Attempts to measure age became meaningless. Birthdays were abandoned because no one could agree on when a year had truly passed. Mothers marked walls with pencil lines that never seemed to align with memory. Fathers avoided looking too closely at their children, fearing they would notice something that could not be explained away. The hollow, the survivors believed, was practicing through them, learning how to keep what it wanted unchanged and accelerate what it did not need to linger. Some children disappeared without drama, slipping into the forest or the earth itself, their absence leaving no grief sharp enough to cut through the numbness that had settled over the colony. Others remained but felt incomplete, their emotions muted, their sense of self oddly hollow. The survivors said the hollow preferred children because they were unfinished, easier to shape, easier to pause, easier to reuse. Age, in Hollow Colony, was no longer a measure of time lived, but of usefulness, and the children who never grew old were not blessed or cursed so much as they were kept, preserved at the exact moment they became something the ground beneath the houses decided it did not want to let go of. The ritual to seal the hollow was not born from faith but from exhaustion. By the time the elders agreed that something had to be done, belief had long since rotted into routine, and obedience was maintained less by fear than by the absence of alternatives. The survivors said the idea came from fragments, half-remembered sermons, Appalachian folk practices, and instructions that seemed to rise unbidden from the ground itself. No one could recall exactly who first proposed the ritual, only that when it was spoken aloud, it felt inevitable, like remembering something that had already happened. Preparation took years. The colony stripped itself down to what the hollow tolerated, abandoning possessions that felt too loud or too new. Names were shortened. Houses were rearranged so their foundations aligned with the slope of the land. Children who did not age were kept close, positioned as witnesses rather than participants. The ritual required silence above all else. Silence in speech, in thought, in desire. They were told that to seal the hollow, they would have to stop wanting anything from it, including its absence. On the chosen night, the entire colony gathered in the open ground where the soil breathed the strongest. No fire was lit. No prayers were spoken. Instead, each person was instructed to recall the first time they had asked the hollow for help and to withdraw that request, not with regret or anger, but with indifference. The survivors said this was the hardest part. Wanting nothing required a kind of emptiness most of them had never practiced. As the hours passed, the ground grew warm, then cold, then warm again, pulsing beneath their feet like a slowed heartbeat. Something went wrong when a child cried out. Whether it was fear, pain, or instinct, no one could say. The sound broke the silence, sharp and alive, and the hollow responded immediately. The earth shifted, not violently, but with precision, rearranging itself in ways that defied geometry. Shadows bent inward. Voices echoed before they were spoken. The ritual did not fail so much as it completed itself incorrectly, sealing not the hollow, but the people around it. When dawn came, Hollow Colony was changed. Those who remained found that they could no longer leave the central ground without effort that left them breathless and disoriented. Time stalled. Sunlight dulled. The hollow no longer answered prayers because it no longer needed to. The survivors believed they had trapped themselves in a state neither alive nor dead, suspended at the exact moment the ritual fractured. They said the hollow accepted the attempt as a lesson. It learned how to keep a place repeating, how to replay a single night endlessly without decay. The colony did not end, it looped. Each failed attempt to live beyond that moment fed the hollow a clearer understanding of human persistence and regret, and the ritual that was meant to close the wound in the earth instead taught it how to preserve the wound forever, holding Hollow Colony in a frozen echo of intention and mistake, where the same night continued to exist, over and over, without release. The survivors spoke of Hollow Colony as though it existed in layers, one atop another, each iteration folding into the next, indistinguishable from memory or dream. They described nights that never ended, not in the literal sense, but in the way the hours repeated themselves, hollowed out and empty, yet waited with consequence. Doors opened to the same hallways, fields lay unchanged beneath the moon, and the same wind whispered through the same trees as it had for decades. They said leaving was impossible, not because paths were blocked or mountains shifted, but because the very fabric of the colony had learned to hold them, to press them into its rhythm until they could no longer tell where they ended and the hollow began. Time, in this repeated night, became both their captor and teacher. A child might fall asleep and wake to the same meal, the same chores, the same muted sunlight filtering through leaves that never rustled differently. Adults remembered conversations that had not yet occurred, or that had occurred hundreds of times before, leaving them hesitant to speak, as though the act of speaking could unravel them. The survivors said they learned to move carefully, to avoid small errors that could call attention, because the hollow observed more closely when routine faltered. Even a misstep in walking could echo across the repetition, leaving marks no one could see but everyone could feel. Their language changed to accommodate this endlessness. Words were clipped, sentences repeated in ritualized patterns. Greetings became formalized sequences, and questions were often left unasked. Laughter was rare, reserved for moments of agreement that the hollow seemed to tolerate. They described the sensation of their minds being watched, not just their bodies, and the fear that any deviation from habit could summon correction. It was not pain that punished them, but erasure, forgetting, misplacing, being quietly removed from the flow of events without warning. Some survivors began to perceive movement where none existed. Shadows that did not match the contours of objects. Figures glimpsed at the periphery of vision, present but not fully there. These apparitions were not always menacing, but their constancy suggested awareness, a reflection of the colony's own persistence. The survivors said the hollow used them as instruments to observe themselves, feeding off attention, repetition, and compliance, shaping the settlement into a perfect mirror of its own design. Even when rescued, the survivors carried the memory of the loop. They reported that outside the mountains, the world felt too fast, too disjointed, too untrustworthy. Clocks moved, sunlight shifted, people acted unpredictably. They spoke as though they were seeing an unfamiliar species of time, and their bodies reacted as if in warning. Hollow Colony, they insisted, had not ended. It had merely begun to operate in a mode beyond human comprehension, continuing to exist in a place where every night replayed itself endlessly, teaching the survivors what it meant to be part of a world that no longer belonged to them, and suggesting that the repetition could extend far beyond the mountains themselves. The survivors' accounts were difficult enough to comprehend without the addition of tangible evidence, yet physical signs only deepened the unease. When authorities examined their clothing, bodies, and personal effects, inconsistencies emerged that defied explanation. Hair and fingernails bore growth patterns that did not match their chronological age, some strands appearing decades older than the person while others seemed frozen in early childhood. Skin revealed scars that had never healed, alongside marks that seemed impossibly recent, as if the body itself had been negotiating between decay and stasis. Scientists attempted to catalogue the anomalies, but no known medical or biological principle could account for the irregularities. Even their teeth presented contradictions. Some adults retained molars that should have fallen out in infancy, while others exhibited regrown teeth in places where loss had occurred years before. Blood tests revealed cell regeneration rates that varied wildly from one sample to the next, leaving researchers with numbers that should have been impossible. The survivors' vital signs occasionally mirrored normal human ranges, only to fluctuate abruptly without environmental triggers. Pulse, blood pressure, and respiration seemed to bend to rhythms that existed beyond clocks, almost in response to some unseen cadence within the hollow itself. Objects they had touched or carried also carried traces of phenomena that confounded conventional understanding. Items stored in their possession for decades showed minimal wear, while tools left unused deteriorated rapidly, as if the absence of human attention accelerated decay. Soil found under their nails sometimes contained minerals and microorganisms that did not belong in that geographic region, suggesting interaction with terrain outside of mapped reality. Even footprints left in mud resisted accurate measurement, fading and reforming in patterns that implied temporal distortion rather than simple erosion. The survivors themselves admitted that these inconsistencies were terrifying precisely because they undermined certainty. Every observation contradicted expectation, every measurement failed to fit into known systems. The boundaries between past and present, between cause and effect, blurred. Memory, experience, and evidence no longer aligned, leaving witnesses and researchers alike questioning what was real and what was manufactured by a world they could not perceive fully. They described small moments where walls seemed to bend, where shadows shifted against gravity, and where sound carried messages they could not translate but instinctively obeyed. Authorities struggled to integrate the testimonies with these physical irregularities. Reports that should have been dismissed as fantasy were bolstered by tangible anomalies, yet the anomalies themselves resisted interpretation. Experts from multiple disciplines, biology, geology, psychology, could not reconcile the data. It was as though the Hollow had embedded its own logic into the people who had lived there, creating a system where ordinary observation failed and conventional laws of nature became unreliable. Every shred of evidence, they realized, confirmed the same haunting truth the survivors had been whispering all along. Hollow Colony operated according to rules beyond human comprehension, and whatever had sustained it for decades could not be explained by anything they had ever learned about the world. The survivors' final testimonies carried a weight that went beyond fear, beyond trauma, beyond the strangeness of their altered bodies and the impossible anomalies that clung to them. They insisted that Hollow Colony was not merely a memory or a geographical curiosity, it was a living pattern, something patient, deliberate, and aware, and it had begun to reach beyond its old borders. Those who had left the mountains spoke of dreams they could not shake, faint, rhythmic pulses under the floorboards of their new homes, whispers that came through the walls when no one else was near, and the uncanny sensation of being observed even in crowded streets. The Hollow, they said, was learning again, and this time it was learning from them. It was in the children that this threat became most tangible. Some who had been born in the colony retained the same strange temporality as before, their bodies and minds out of sync with the world around them, and they were drawn to edges, cracks, and gaps as if compelled by instinct. Adults reported moments when these children would stop moving mid-step, their eyes widening, ears tilting toward something no one else could hear, and then they would whisper a name, a place, or a warning that made little sense in ordinary terms. The survivors were convinced the Hollow used these moments to test boundaries, mapping the wider world in ways humans could not perceive. Even objects carried from the colony appeared to hold influence. Soil, small trinkets, and pieces of cloth retained traces of the Hollow's presence, and when placed in new environments, subtle distortions followed. Crooked furniture, small fractures in walls, and clocks that ran too fast or too slow were reported by those who had tried to integrate into society. Researchers could find no causal link, yet the patterns were consistent enough to suggest that the Hollow's imprint had not remained confined to the mountains. Its awareness, they implied, was extending outward, seeking continuity, feeding on attention, repetition, and the faintest traces of memory in those who had lived within it. The survivors warned that this reach was not indiscriminate. The Hollow sought those who could perceive its patterns, who could sense its logic, or who had been touched by it before. It was selective, patient, and methodical. Invitations were never announced. The Hollow simply began the process, waiting for individuals to notice, to respond, to unknowingly participate. Resistance, the survivors noted, was less meaningful than awareness. Simply knowing it existed, or remembering its rhythms, made someone a candidate. Their words left investigators unsettled. It was no longer a question of geography or history. Hollow Colony was something that transcended boundaries. The survivors claimed that wherever they went, part of it followed, mapping the world in subtle ways, teaching itself, waiting for openings, preparing to draw in the unwary. In this way, the colony was neither past nor present, it was a persistent, patient force, one that had begun to expand, and whose expansion promised consequences that were, in every sense, impossible to predict.